to be on the other side of the door Bria never could have. Imagine that she'd be face to face with the scandal-driven playboy she'd been hearing about just a little while ago. On the radio, she barely recognized the man without his customary designer suit and silk tie. His dark hair was mussed about as if he'd just gotten out of the shower and hadn't bothered to brush through it yet. He was taller than she'd imagined he'd be, and the thin gray tee showed off an impressive set of shoulders. He had a sunburnished glow about him that made him look as though he'd just returned from somewhere exotic, which Bria was sure wasn't unlikely. She thought she recalled seeing a grainy photo of him in a swimsuit and a woman in not much of anything on the cover of a tabloid when she was grocery shopping. A few weeks back, of course, seeing him in person highlighted some things that a camera could never capture, like how intense his dark eyes were when they were staring right at you, his lips shaped into a frown. He looked remarkably imposing for a guy who was barefoot and wearing plaid pajama bottoms. "Yes?" he asked, sounding suspicious. She was caught off guard by his question. She'd been counting on the fact that someone would open the door and see her standing there, shivering not far from it, freezing to death, and that would be enough to make her host spring into action. Surely, on a night like tonight, no one with a drop of humanity in them would leave someone out in the cold, but, of course, she hadn't imagined that. George Clark would be the one answering the door with all the paparazzi that followed him. Around suspicious was probably his default mode for anyone he didn't personally know. And on the one hand, she saw where he was coming from, since the press had rarely been kind, but on the other hand, she wouldn't have another hand if she didn't get inside before frostbite set in. There was reasonable suspicion, and then there was just failure to be human. She waited to see where on the spectrum he'd land. For a second, she considered leaving and just finding another place, but she knew it was too late to turn around. She would never make it to the next house. Still, she managed nothing more than a dumbfounded look and a small groan as the cold cut through her skin like needles. She was sure that, as she stood there, her blood was turning to ice can. "I help you?" he added, obviously irritated with her standing there nearly. Mute failure to be human, it is then, she thought to herself. She didn't relish the thought of spending a moment more with this man, even if for just an hour or two while. She waited for a tow truck, but she knew it was the best option she had. She sighed, resigning herself, and sucking up her pride, she could force herself to play nice. For just a little while, she just hoped that he would do the same. I'm sorry to bother you," she said through chattering teeth, "but my car broke down, and I need to call someone, but my phone, there's no service. Do you mind if I use your phone?" He only stared at her, seeming annoyed by her presence and clearly debating whether or not to trust her enough to let her in. What did he need an oath signed in blood? Swearing that she wasn't a tabloid journalist, tough luck for him, if that was what he was after. Her blood was too frozen to be usable, and her hands were too numb to hold a pen. She thought about saying exactly that, but her family had given her lots of practice at biting her tongue and being polite when she didn't want to be. She could put all that training to use now. PP, please. "I just need to make a call. I can leave as soon as the town truck gets here." It killed her to say it, but she still managed to stutter out one more please. Before waiting for his response, a sleek black lab wandered to the open door with a wagging tail and leaned up against George. Brea wished she could bury her cold fingers in the dog's fur. G.E. reached down to grasp the dog's collar and leaned out the door to glance around, taking in the scene. Was he considering sending her back out into it? Could only wait and see what his decision would be. He stared out into the blackness for so long that she started to think he'd forgotten that she was standing in front of him, about to freeze to death. Just when she was convinced he was about to send her on her way, he stepped back. Was he going to shut the door in her face? But no, he just puffed out in annoyance and gestured inside. "Well," he said, sounding impatient, "aren't you going to come in?" Her jaw dropped and shock held her still for a moment while his expression downgraded into annoyance. "Do you mind hurrying it up? It's a bit chilly out there." Snapping out of her daze, she scurried through the door and into the warmth of the great room. It felt so good that she wanted to cry. And for a moment she didn't move, relishing the heat thrown off by the massive fireplace. After a few seconds, when it finally began to sink in that she was safe and wasn't going to freeze to death after all, curiosity kicked in enough for her to glance around and really take in her surroundings. And And then her jaw dropped again. George Carter's woodsy hideaway was anything but quaint. From the fireplace that looked big enough to stand inside of to the soaring beam ceiling, completely draped with evergreens to the massive Adler chandelier, the place looked like a luxury ski resort. Bria finally noticed that George was holding his hand out to her, waiting for her to hand over her jacket. Well, at least he can be a gentleman when he wants, she thought to herself mockingly, or maybe he just didn't want. Her dripping snow all over his floor, yes, that seemed more likely. She pulled it from her shoulders and handed it to him, knitted scarf, and all thank you, I'll be quick. Where's your phone? She tried to sound confident, but she was still thawing out, and she realized that. The trek through the snow had exhausted her. Her words came out almost slurred and drunken, and brow was flooded with embarrassment as he walked past her this way. He led her into the kitchen where landline phone was tucked away in what was likely a butler's pantry. My cell is out too, so maybe it's good. Never got rid of this relic, but I wouldn't get your hopes up on the line being in very good shape in this storm. Do you have the yellow pages by any chance? She asked. She had no idea who to call about a tow, and it seemed her phone wouldn't be any help in letting her look up the closest service station. To her surprise and relief, he reached into a cabinet and then handed her a phone book. I never thought this thing would get used for anything other than kindling for the fireplace, but I guess it's a good thing I kept it on hand. He chuckled as he grabbed a beer from the fridge and walked from the room with his dog at his heels, leaving her alone in the dim room, feeling a bit more comfortable without him so close by. She relaxed and looked around the exterior of the cabin had looked unassuming, but the more she saw of the place, the more obvious it became that the design was architectural camouflage. So cars passing by wouldn't realize that it was a playboy's hideaway. The kitchen was lined with massive mullion windows that looked out onto what Brea could only assume was an award-worthy view in non-whiteout conditions. The room had a clean, stark look of a restaurant-caliber kitchen, and she couldn't imagine that George ever set foot in it other than to grab drinks from the fridge. There was obviously room for staff in the place, but he seemed to be in the cabin alone except for the dog otherwise. Surely he would have sent someone else to deal with the riffraff that showed up on his front porch. Bria shrugged. Didn't matter, because she planned to get the hell out as quickly as possible.